All right, and you're live.
Good morning, everyone. It's 10 a.m. on the Eastern Seaboard in New York, and it's that time. It's Monday, and it's time for the Sirius Report with London Paul. And folks, if you haven't gotten a chance, go to the Sirius Report. That's Sirius, thesiriusreport.com, and subscribe to his member services that he has, that London Paul has, for less than the price of a latte per month. Okay, you for $4.75 per month. You're going to get the best intel report day in, day out, 5 days a week from London Poll himself to understand the big geopolitical landscape. Folks, you got to educate yourself on the multipolar world. And if you want to educate yourself on the multipolar world and why it's here and the goings thereon and understand who the key players are, then you need to go to the SiriusReport.com and get that special subscriber member, get on that membership list. It is invaluable. Consider it your daily presidential briefing on the world. With that out of the way, London Paul, how are you, sir?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Yeah, I'm doing fine. And yourself?
Oh, we're hanging in there, man. Just recovering from the weekend. It's Monday. A lot of things going on. Man, where do we begin, Paul? Flip flopping here, the backpedaling here. It's just I don't know where to start, man. I don't know where to start. So
Well,
take
yeah,
us
it's quite
where you want to go.
confusing. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Well, maybe
Confusion
I
is an
think we should.
understatement.
Yeah, yeah. I think we should probably talk about the Feds because there's this big build up to Wednesday, and when there's this announcement or supposed to be an announcement, they're going to start trimming their 4.5 trillion portfolio of junk, basically. And
Mhm.
now, obviously, it sounds really grandiose, and there's also talk, oh, they're going to raise interest rates. So I think it's worth mentioning. Obviously, apparently, the plan is that the Feds are going to stop buying bonds. Basically, what it means is when bonds mature, they won't buy them again. But they're gradually going to wind the balance sheet down. But apparently, it's at the rate of 10 billion US dollars a month, so 120 billion a year. So if you do the maths, it's going to take decades to wind this down. And they're very confident, of course, that in all this time it takes to wind it down, that the economy is going to recover. And this is, it's testimony to wonderful Fed policy. Although, of course, what the Feds don't tell you is that the asset holdings stood at about, well, nearly 900 billion in mid 2008 before the whole financial crisis happened. Of course, they began buying bonds, trying to convince us all that it'd be create this wonderful economic growth, and everyone businesses will be hiring people. And of course, economically that's absolute nonsense. So, in a sense, they're trying to manage this expectation so it doesn't cause any ripples or bumps in the Dow and the S&P.
Yeah.
And undoubtedly, they're not going to raise interest rates this week. I'd be very, very surprised if they do that. But in essence, of course, if you look at the reality of what they're suggesting doing, and you start to look at the sort of economics of what's happened, they're trying to avoid, because remember in 2013 there was this whole idea when Bernanke suggested that they're going to have this taper, and of course the markets flipped out and it spiked bond yields, and they kind of retracted that
Mhm.
and never proceeded effectively. Now, the reality is, if you look at the true economics of what's going on, it just doesn't stack up. And I went away and had a look, and not just in a historical perspective, because if you look at Japan's a great example. They were the first major central bank to introduce QE, and back in 2001, they ended it in 2006, and of course, lo and behold, there was this huge economic downturn, so they had to restart QE and expand it enormously, and it's nowhere near close to ending purchases. The European Central Bank's the same. They undertook two rate hikes in 2011. They subsequently had to reverse it, and then in 2015 started its own purchase. And now they're claiming, well, we might reduce purchases, but well, maybe we will, and maybe we won't. So there's this whole back sort of catalogue of seeing what happens. That once you start QE, you can never end it. Now, okay, they can arguably say they're not going to repurchase maturing bonds. Well, fine. In terms of, but if you look at interest rates,
Mm.
there's some interesting correlation. When you actually look at the Fed's funding rate and you track that against personal interest rate, and obviously we all know back in the 80s the interest rates were at 15%, and they gradually moved all the way down, and we had 5% or so before the the 2008 crisis, and of course, virtually zero interest rates. And the current Fed funding rate is about 1.2%, roughly. Now, the interesting thing, if you look at the profile of personal interest payments, in the last sort of 35 years or so, it's gone from roughly $40 billion, and it peaked at around 300 billion plus in around 2009 or 2008, just before the crisis. Then it kind of dipped. Now it's approaching back at that level. So this is just personal interest payments. So if the Fed start hiking interest rates like they're claiming, all that's going to do is see a significant hike in interest rates, which is going to kill the likes of you and me in the process. That's another reason why they simply are incapable of doing it. You've also seen in the last 6 years, credit card delinquencies have risen around 50% in that period. I mean, they really spiked during the 2008 crisis, and then they kind of rapidly bottomed out around just past 2010. And then the other problem you also have is that when you look at the real disposable personal income of people, it's kind of cratered. I mean, it's kind of recovered slightly from 2014 to 2015, and it's dropped off. And in that time of period, as you say, these personal interest payments have gone through the roof. So we've got this sort of double whammy of raising interest rates will kill the consumer like you and I, and also personal incomes are relatively falling in the process, which is going to kill the consumer. The other thing, of course, is, and when you look, and I did a bit of analysis on all the previous bubbles we've had, when we had the 2000 sort of .com era and then the crisis and the markets fell off a cliff edge. At that point, it was just equities really that was the bubble. And then you go to 2008, there was the housing bubble predominantly. Now, when you come to 2017, everything's a bubble. Equities are a bubble. The house prices people are claiming isn't a bubble, but from my perspective, it's a bubble. Government bonds are in a bubble. So everything's stacking up. Whereas you used to get one or two things that would create problems in the market and cause a crash. Now you've got everything that's causing a crash. So when you look at the Federal Reserve coming out with these comments that they're going to start tapering effectively, or they're going to start, not buying back the matured bonds at such a small level, it's a complete illusion. It is absolutely baseless. And they're absolutely in no position to raise interest rates. So the point of mentioning all this is there's going to be a lot of hot air coming out of, the various usual kind of financial channels that exist, and economists and everyone trying to justify what the Feds are doing and justify their course of action, and everything they're doing makes complete sense. And of course, it's an utter illusion, and we could talk for weeks about this, but it's worth mentioning it simply on the basis that absolutely nothing stacks up. And the reality is, when the next financial meltdown happens at whatever point in, whether it's next month, next year, doesn't really matter. The first thing the Feds are going to do is they're just going to go into QE overload. They're going to start going, well, let's just purchase $1 trillion of something. I mean, because it's the only way they can shore things up from their perspective, which of course is an illusion. So the specter of QE is always on the horizon. I mean, they keep talking about raising interest rates, and we all know all the economic factors prove it's absolute nonsense that they're in any position to do that. You raise interest rates when an economy is strong, not when it's as weak as it is in the US and not just the US for that matter in the process. So I just thought it was worth mentioning that, because people will see a lot of hot air coming out this week about it. And it's all an illusion. It makes no difference, because at the end of the day, all they're going to do is just keep propping the markets up. And we've seen recently what's happened. The S&P's, at record highs. The Dow went to record highs. This is just the way it's going to be, and it's all an illusion. And don't take any notice of it. But while they keep hiking it, then the desperation's there, and if it goes to 25,000, the Dow, and the S&P goes to 2,700, just further indication of the panic to hold everything up. But economic reality is killing them, and just some of the stats we presented just proves that eloquently.
Absolutely. The economic, I don't know who coined the term. I think it was David Stockman who said economic mother nature. So aptly said, because you could dodge, you could lie, you could fabricate, you could, coerce, you could do whatever you want, manipulate the market, the metrics, the real data as much as you want. Not the real data, but the fictitious data that's put out there by governmental agencies and the stock market and Wall Street in general. But there's a time when it comes to paying the piper, Paul, and I think this year, as we're closing out 2017, going into 2018, I think the piper will be paid.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting closer and closer to that day. I mean, it's just indicative of the fact, if you look at world stock markets, they hit a record high today. And there's this big thing, oh, look, the dollar's reached this 8-week high against the yen. Oh, because the Federal Reserve's going to start trimming the balance sheet. And it's this wonderful example of the reversal of cheap money worldwide. Well, the reality is, the reason that the dollar is spiking against the yen is to suppress the price of gold. Just look at the correlation. When the dollar yen goes up, the price of gold goes down. I mean, it almost tracks it with incredible synchronicity. But in reality, the dollar index is still down. It's at around 92. I think it was around 100 not that long ago. So, and the interesting thing is, in the time we've had the North Korean crisis, all the currencies, like the South Korean currency and China and Japan, well, apart from have largely, I mean, lately it hasn't, but have largely raised against the dollar in the process. So it's just indicative. They're just doing everything to massage the illusion and create this idea that everything's fine. And of course, in the process, who's likely to be selling out? There's lots of indication that insiders within big corporations are bailing out of stocks. Well, no surprise. And who's going to be left carrying the can? Well, fortuitously, it seems less and less that the average little retailer is left carrying the can like it was in the old days. It's just algos and computers, algorithms that are basically holding the stock in some fictitious manner. So I think fortuitously,
it's the electronic duct tape, Paul.
But the only slight concern I would have is pension funds, because people, typically, I don't know how it works necessarily in the US particularly, but people who pay into pension funds pay on a monthly basis, and it's supposed to iron out the fluctuations. Well, they may be sitting pretty thinking, I've got a nice big fat pension fund, but those pension funds are going to get massacred when any major correction happens, and that's where it will hit people, and did obviously in 2008, and not just on a personal level of holding, stocks in corporation X, Y, or Z. So that's obviously another consideration. So, but yeah, I just thought it was worth mentioning that, just because it's going to be all over the news in the next couple of days, and it's all just hot air and as per usual.
Absolutely. The whole thing as well with these funds, these pension funds in particular, always wanting 7%, 8%, 9% return on investments in a market where there's really no liquidity. It's getting harder and harder to do that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, yeah, absolutely.
And let's be honest here. Most of these people who are managing these pension funds, and most of these companies are handling these pension funds, they are putting these funds in directed investment accounts. These are not funds that you put money into. It really benefits whoever's the firm that's handling the fund, because the amount of money you're making off of fees, it benefits
exactly.
Yeah. I mean,
of course.
I've done enough talking to these pension fund companies where they're like, oh yeah, we're these guys come to us, they're thinking they're going to be paying 2%. We rake them off the coals for 10 to 15% on fees. We all built it into their into the administrative costs and this, that, and the other fund. And more often than not, it's these pension funds are losing money in these markets. And my question to a lot of these guys who are doing this is like, for the love of God, just put it into a stupid index fund at least. At least, it won't be as bad as these managed funds, which are getting killed. And we see what's happened in Ohio. Here it is, over $1 billion state fund reduced to nothing. They're in the negatives. California,
exactly.
paying people in IOUs. This is the next big thing to pop, Paul, without a doubt. I agree with you.
Oh, yeah, we've talked a lot about pension funds, exactly. And that is going to be a huge problem for sure.
Yep.
But yeah, I think we can't not mention something about the whole kind of what's gone on with Bitcoin lately. I mean, we had the rise to $5,000 a coin, and then it kind of fell back to 3,000 very quickly, and now it's kind of back at 4,000. In the middle of it all, we've got Jamie Dimon saying that Bitcoin's a fraud, and then there's allegations that JP Morgan were buying sizable chunks of Bitcoin. And I mean,
I'll fire the trader who's trading it for being stupid.
Yes. Well, a lot of I've had people. Yeah. I mean, I've had people getting in touch about, do you know, frankly, I'm less concerned about the fact of what Jamie Dimon's saying. What concerns me more is the fact that we're seeing the likes of JP Morgan and certainly Goldman Sachs have buying sizable chunks into the likes of Bitcoin or
Right.
whatever other cryptocurrencies. Now, we come back to this whole point of decentralization. For me, the biggest concern is when you see them buying in, what is their reason? They're not just buying in for the sake of it. Are they looking for a quick turnaround and a big profit? Possibly. Are they buying into it to subvert the price in some way? Well, if they buy sufficient stock, or or sufficient coins, sorry, they have the potential to move the market around. That concerns me when you have banks doing it because it starts to damage the credibility of decentralization when banks that size can do it. Now, China's a great example where there's a lot of people getting very upset because China's basically saying, well, we're going to shut down exchanges, and then there was rumors they weren't. Now, apparently, they're going to shut down exchanges, and they're going to be really sort of quite brutal in their treatment of Bitcoin.
No, not at all.
And no, the reality is they're doing all this not to attack Bitcoin. They're doing all this to attack Wall Street and the
Right.
capitalists. That is why they're doing this. That may surprise people, but it's not. They're very pro cryptocurrencies. Why? Because they're going to launch their own cryptocurrency in the future. Now, people might not like asset-backed ones, but that's beside the point. It doesn't really matter whether people agree with it or don't. That's what they intend doing. And
Right.
if you want to get invest in it, invest in it. If you don't, you don't. People can pay the money and take their choice. But the reality is, this is not an attack on Bitcoin. This is an attack on the capitalists and Wall Street because they foreseeing exactly what's going on. And when you see the price crater 40% in very little time, and then suddenly comments get made, the price falls to 3,000, then it bounces back, and yeah, it's risen 30% in a very short space of time. And it's this kind of volatility, which I've highlighted before, that concerns me. If we want to get broad acceptance of cryptocurrencies, then this kind of volatility is going to scare a lot of people. And to be honest, if I was sat there watching that kind of volatility, it wouldn't scare me, but I'd be slightly concerned as to, I mean, a bit of volatility you need, and there's no doubt there's huge volatility because there's massive amounts of trading, billions a day is being traded on it. So that's going to create the volatility, but that needs something that needs addressing. But China is not anti-cryptocurrencies, it's not anti-Bitcoin. There's a bigger thing in play here to do with, and I think the fact that JP Morgan are investing proves that. There's no doubt Goldman Sachs were dissing Bitcoin, and then suddenly they were pro Bitcoin, and we see the same coming out from Diamond, and then they're buying into it. But it does concern me when we see banks like that buying into it. What is their motivation? Because there's no doubt about it, whatever people feel about Bitcoin, whatever they feel about any cryptocurrency at this point, cryptocurrencies and blockchain are here to stay, and they're going to revolutionize
Yep.
many walks of life. And I covered something in a podcast very briefly of about a dozen or so big areas where you're going to see big changes because of blockchain. So there's no doubt about it. Now, the whole ethos of cryptocurrencies and blockchain challenges the whole banking system. So why are they buying into it? They're not buying into it because they're supporting something which can be highly detrimental to them. So what's the motivation? That concerns me, and
Yeah,
and I think
I
it's a
think.
legitimate concern.
Yeah, I think basically what they're trying to do is, I think I think the answer is C. It's all of the above. I think they are trying to buy into it to profit from it in the short term. I think they are buying into it to try to manipulate whatever they can, especially on the exchange level, which is the only thing they have to manipulate the price here and there. Um, at the same time, I think these fools are damn drunk in their own hubris, Paul. I literally think because they're part of the power structure and they literally have drunken themselves into a stupor, thinking that their power structure, their power, their influence will never be diminished. And so they're
Oh,
going to,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. And so I think this,
I think it's a very valid point because undoubtedly the situation is in terms of from the Fed's perspective, in the financial perspective, and in those echelons, they think the US is the top dog. They think the
exactly
dollar's here to stay. They think that the US can still go around the world and dictate to nations. And,
right.
US hegemony is alive and well, and they just don't see the reality. And undoubtedly, they don't see the reality of what's going to happen with
No,
cryptocurrencies and blockchain in the future.
right.
So, I mean, and it is in a sense that's their weakness, which is actually, something that does give me confidence, because there's no doubt they're completely oblivious to what's coming,
Yeah,
even
they really are.
even when yeah.
Yeah, like I'd be more concerned about what China and Russia is doing in relation to cryptos, and they are, pro cryptos, and like you said, they're coming out with their own cryptos as well. Uh, I mean, what a bunch of these broke, insolvent Western banksters who still think, like you said, Paul, they still think they can go around the world imposing their wants on the rest of the planet. It's these guys are they're oblivious. You're absolutely right. They're totally oblivious.
Oh, it's staggering. I mean, I've heard some sort of back channel conversations that have gone on with people. No, I'm not talking about Diamond or anyone in particular, but just it is absolutely staggering how they still perceive that, everything they're doing is they're winning. The European Union's strong, the US dollar's here to stay. They've sorted the financial crisis out. I mean, you just cannot comprehend, if you put a few simple facts in front of them, how they just can't see it. But they're so blinded by by a combination of arrogance, ignorance, inane thinking, and just the idea that, the world can't possibly change. But meanwhile, the world is changing, and you know Venezuela is a great example of an attempt, a typical attempt to whatever we think of Maduro, they tried to destroy the country, and they've failed. And we said a long time back that China and Russia were backstopping it. Of course, what do we see? The whole kind of petro yuan floated ideas, and I've noticed there's people claiming this is all bogus, and well, no, it's absolutely the case. And what do we see? Venezuela is the first kind of pilot scheme where they've gone, well, we're going to trade oil in yuan,
Yep.
possibly euros, but probably mainly yuan. I mean, they're the kind of trailblazers for the petro yuan, effectively. And the great thing is, from China's perspective, it takes all the heat off that, because this is Venezuela doing it, but it's a backdoor way, because the one thing, and we've said it for a long time, China wants the end of the Kabbalists. They want an end of U.S. hegemony and the U.S. dollar, because it's killing the world. It's doing the U.S. no favors, and we've seen precisely economically what it's doing to the U.S. But the one thing is they're reluctant to do. They don't want to be seen to be the one, pushing the button, precisely because then the Kabbalists will use that as, oh, it's China economically trying to destroy us in the process. But the great thing is, because of the hubris, because of their arrogance, they're still telling everyone everything's fine. So in
Right.
a sense, they're actually causing their own destruction in that regard, because if they were voicing concerns, which they can't do because it will hit the markets, and then the whole illusion will collapse. But by not doing that, they're actually storing up problems for themselves, because they can't suddenly say, oh, China's suddenly been responsible for destroying the global economy, when they're telling everyone for the last 5, 6, 7 years that the global economy is getting stronger and everything's fine and wonderful. Well, the Feds have told us that. The Bank of England, a bit of caution, but largely telling us everything's all right. The ECB doing, as Draghi says, we'll just whatever needs to be done, we'll do, and it doesn't stack up then with the reality. But equally, China doesn't want to be seen to be the aggressor in this. But it comes to the point that if the US threatens them the way Munchen's claiming he is, and I'm not saying he's going to follow through on it, but at some point they will have to just push the button, and in the process, the dollar will be eviscerated very quickly, and it's game over. But by allowing Venezuela to do this, it also circumvents, of course, the sanctions, as we said before, and it's notice the mainstream media has hardly talked about it, because they don't want to face the reality that the petro yuan, for want of a better word, is coming, and it's a reality.
Right.
And but so they just don't want to face that, because it's a very uncomfortable proposition that says, well, what happens to the petrodollar? But of course, they still believe the petrodollar will be here to stay, because, after all, China and Russia are third world nations who are economically very weak. And even though we've seen economically, particularly with China, but also to some extent economically, but largely militarily, that Russia now rules the roost, and that's happened in the Middle East. That's self-evident. I mean, with
Right.
the US climb down is spectacular for that very reason. And North Korea is another example where, despite all the hot air rhetoric, the US climbed down for that very reason. So there is this huge shift. It's there for everyone to see, but they still, give this. And I know people, well, who still say to me, this is just not reality. You're just making this up. It can't be happening. Well, well, look at what is happening around you every day, every week, every month. It's a reality.
Right.
What don't you see that's happening? What have you not seen in the Middle East? What are you not seeing from Vladivostok in the east, practically all the way to Lisbon in the western and north and south and everywhere else? You're not seeing these big changes, but they just can't comprehend the fact that China and Russia are now not dominant nations, but they're the stronger nation who are bringing about the multipolar world. But it all comes back to arrogance, ignorance, and just a complete lack of critical thinking that the world could possibly change.
Yeah, absolutely. The also the fact that, look at the countries that are now, shifting towards the east. Look at the fact that last week Nicholas the Sweetness, the bus driver Maduro, has come out and said, yeah, we're not going to no longer accept dollars for settlement for payment for our oil. We'll use the yuan, we'll use the rupee, we'll use the euro, we'll use the yen, we'll use the ruble. So the entire world of any kind of nation that's worth its weight in salt, or a nation that has some sort of a commodity wealth, they are right now de-dollarizing. They are right now de-dollarizing. They see, look, these guys, and since 2008, Paul, they have made the dollar not only the most toxic, not only the most toxic asset in the world, but they've also made the dollar the most dangerous asset in the world, because it comes with a very provocative, very dangerous U.S. government.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that sums it up quite eloquently. And I think the thing is with, you know, it's a very sad, it's quite painful to say it, but I mean, there's something that technologically is worth mentioning, and this shows the extent of the plans for the One Belt, One Road. And what it is there's been an idea to build this canal between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf. Now, it's been around for, well, probably 900 years. Now, you look at the issues and go, it's going to be longer than the Great Canal of China. It'd have to pass through mountains of 1,500 to 2,000 meters in height. And you think, this is an engineering impossibility. And then what happens? How about the thought that you build a tunnel through these mountains with not a single lock required? Now, people will
Yeah.
say, that's technologically impossible. Well, there's a company called Herrennecht in Germany who does
Mm-hmm.
precisely that. They can tunnel through it, they can create tube systems for water, railroad, and tunnels. And yes, they can make the waterway any size required. And they have the technology to bore any size void required, even through this depth of the mountain. Now, people say, well, this, from a cost perspective, this is prohibitive. Well, it isn't, because these technologies are advancing rapidly and they're getting cheaper and cheaper. But the technology is incredible. I mean, it's fully automated. It requires very few people to be in the construction site. And they line their tunnel walls with composite that makes the tunnel earthquake proof. They run a core machine followed by even bigger core machines. And then they actually take the bore tailings and analyze them for extractable minerals. So if there's any mineral wealth in there, they'll extract that in the process.
There you go.
So the cost goes down with every project they do, so the economics are guaranteed. The biggest plus point, the transport route is totally secure. You've got minimal maintenance because there's no weather impact, because it's all going through the mountainous system. And the bit like the pipelines you get from Russia to Europe, they're all interconnected with high-speed fiber optic cables, so you can install that in the process for communication. The Italians are involved in manufacturing the cables. That's Pirelli. You've got the Germans with Herrennecht. And in the process, the US cabal are absolutely spitting blood. That all this infrastructure is being put in the ground and the sea and everywhere else. And the truth is, I mean, you only have to ask yourself, what sort of rail system does the US currently even have?
Well, Paul, I
You know,
took the rail system just before, last week. It was wonderful. I was traveling at a rapid 60 miles per hour, shaking and rattling and rolling. It reminded me of some of the trains I would take in Southeast Asia. I thought I had to go to the bathroom and pee into a little hole in the ground, Paul. I mean, it's just unreal.
I mean, and this is the sad fact: the U.S. infrastructure, by even Trump's own admission, they need $1 trillion, which probably means 2 trillion, maybe 3 trillion, to rebuild the U.S., which is in significant disrepair And the rail system is one example, and the roads and bridges and everything else. And in the process, we see this Chinese One Belt One Road project using real high tech, technology, and it's involving Europeans in this example. And at some point they will do that. And what will, and I mean, in terms of putting a canal through the mountainous system, people would say, "Oh, it's just not possible." But we're reaching the point where this technology is possible, and it's cost effective to do it. That'll revolutionize that part of the world by putting a canal between that. Yeah, it's going to be probably, I don't know, about 1,500 kilometers long. It's enormous. It's a huge project, but it's very likely going to happen. And this is what you're going to see increasingly, is incredible technological advancements made to develop parts of the world that would, 5-10 years ago, people would have said this is impossible. But and this is the thing, again, once that the capitalists, and not just the US, but all of them, just haven't got their head around that the technology exists, and the Chinese and the Russian and the Europeans. I mean, the Germans have incredible engineering technology. I mean, we've known this for 100 years and even longer. But also the Chinese and the Russians are developing technology. And when you put all these together, they can come up with incredible solutions to seemingly impossible problems. And they'll be able to circumvent these kind of issues all over the globe, which will mean lines of communication and transportation will improve hugely. And of course, yes, there's all the Hyperloop technology, etc., which is coming down the track. And these are realistic technological goals.
Right. China's already developing a Hyperloop, which is actually going. I think it's going to be active before the end of the year, or sometime in early 2018. These things are tested at like 720, 800 miles per hour, man.
Oh yeah, well, like I say, with the Russians and the Chinese, when they tell you they're developing something, they already have the product.
Exactly.
When they say they're testing the product, they finish testing. They're always very cagey about what they're doing. It's rather like someone saying to me the other day, well, since the Chinese joined the SDR, they've not bought any gold. So that proves the point that the SDR is important. I mean, does anyone seriously imagine the Chinese are going to tell the world what they're really doing with the gold markets? I mean, well, never mind the amount of gold production they have with internally. They've been buying enormous quantities of gold for years. I mean, not quite as much as they did, simply because the gold doesn't exist. So they're not going to tell people what they're doing. Rather like the Russians did with their military budgets, they hid it. Yeah. So the Americans thought they weren't spending any money on anything, when in fact they were. And why would they be honest and tell the West what they're doing? And technologically, it's a example. But we're going to see these engineering projects, and it was worth mentioning that because it seems kind of incredible that it's possible to do this, but it's very much reality, and it's going to become more and more commonplace going forward.
Absolutely correct, man. And it's funny to see that we don't have an answer for anything in the U.S. I mean, look at the Hyperloop here. The Hyperloop in the United States exists only in paper. Like, I've been to the spots in California where they're making the Hyperloop. All I see is a couple of pillars erected off the ground. That's it. It's existing on paper. It's vaporware. Like, we've become a country that pays money for vaporware, Paul. I mean, look at the idiot Elon Musk, who's, in my opinion, Elon Musk has gone full-blown Howard Hughes. The man's nuts. He's literally tweeting things in the middle of the night that are the most incredulous things in the world. Okay? His recent tweet that he did just a few weeks ago, okay, the last tweet that I read from him, he was talking about, Hyperloop deal has been done between New York and DC. And everybody, the idiots who follow this moron, and he's a snake oil salesman, Paul. He's a guy who runs a company that cannot exist without government handouts. He runs a corporate welfare operation, and he profits on carbon credits. That's how Tesla makes their money. And yet this guy's talking about doing a Hyperloop deal between New York and DC. The whole thing is just a fictitious idea. And then people are celebrating Paul. And then he gets on stage talking about his future truck and his future car projects, all of which are vaporware, and his dumb stock price goes up another 5%. It's incredulous to me. We sell vaporware. The Chinese and Russians are actually selling physical, delivered, in-hand technology, Paul. It's amazing.
Well, yeah, they are. And the proof, we just look at the Russian military technology, that everyone in the world wants it now because they know it it's, I mean, the S400s, they've got S500s in development, which they say years off, but no, they're not. They're much further down the track in terms of that development. These or missile systems work brilliantly. So Turkey's going to buy them, and they don't care what NATO says, even though, the idea they're in NATO is all but in name, but that's not the point. And yes, technologically, nations are, and this is where it's really important that Germany has to rotate as well, because they're getting screwed with all their wonderful technology because of the sanctions. And even though, of course, there's everyone's circumventing the sanctions as much as they possibly can, and are finding more and more ingenious and intuitive ways of getting around it. But that's not the point. The day that Germany rotates east and gets up there, then it'll become an even stronger nation, because in engineering terms, it has fantastic technology, it always has, and it always will do. And
And they
at the
have
moment, they're
talent.
not able to fully, yeah.
Germany still breaks a lot of engineers, out of college year in and year out, versus the United States right now. I think, we're breaking a lot of liberal arts degrees, a lot of, lesbian dance therapy degrees. Uh, these are the things that we are getting ready to unleash upon the new multipolar world. Paul, is our lesbian dance degrees and experts in sociology and the different forms of transgenderism, and do you identify as a squirrel? What kind of squirrel do you identify? Is it a flying squirrel? Is it a normal? I mean, this is what we offer the world, Paul.
Well, yeah, but the UK is I mean, we deride people doing engineering degrees, so we don't have that kind of manufacturing technological base anymore. Although I think there's finally some realization that has to change. But
Yeah.
uh, people are less inclined to study the sciences, and I'm not saying that's the be and end all, because it isn't. But there's been an emphasis, whereas nations like Germany are very, interested in maintaining that, because you know, that is the bread and butter of their economy. Effectively, it's what can make them a huge amount of money, because technology and manufacturing is the heart of any economy. Agriculture, I think, also is, and I mean, Holland's a great example. I put something in a podcast. I mean, I'm not going to go into great detail because it's a long thing, but they revolutionized the agricultural world. I mean, what they're doing is
Sure.
absolutely incredible. With no disrespect, but it's a very small nation in the grand scheme of things. But it leads the world in agricultural development, and it's exporting those ideas to other nations. And this is what's required, and that's something that the multipolar world will be about: is exporting ideas, so other nations can benefit from it. Whereas currently the unipolar world is anything but that, without stating the obvious. But that is precisely where we're at the current point in time, and Europe's starting to recognise that and make those changes.
Yep. Absolutely, man. Absolutely. It's crazy.
Yeah.
What else is on your radar,
What?
Paul?
Well, we can't not mention the latest kind of UK terrorist attack on the
Yes.
tubes, and undoubtedly people are going to say it never happened and it
Oh
was a
God.
false flag. And look, the reality is, and we covered this off, and I put a YouTube clip out a while ago, and was Barcelona the start of a new terrorist threat? It is reality. What's happening, and it's proven, is that as the war in Syria and Iraq winds down, there's disaffected people leaving these regions. They're going back to Europe, other parts of the Middle East, Africa, everywhere else, and they're forming terrorist cells. And you're going to see these kind of terrorist threats and events happening now. Okay, fortuitously, it seems that the device didn't go off properly on the tube. So, yes, there's people being injured, but nobody was killed. Uh, and now, and of course, the first thing we see is people jumping on the bandwagon going, oh, there's martial law created. It's all problem, reaction, solution. Look, they've instigated martial law in the UK. No, they
Right.
didn't. What happened is we've had a severe um, terrorist threat alert for years, and they raise it to critical. And when they raise it to critical, they have to redistribute the police in the process. And because we don't have enough police, and that's a separate matter, they then bring the armed forces on the streets in key installations, for example, the
Right.
UK Parliament. And of course, what did they do 2 days later? They downgraded it from critical to severe. The troops disappear from these key locations, and the police go back because they've more or less conducted their investigations, or to the level that they don't require those resources. I mean, there's still people being arrested and investigations going on. But that's the reality. This martial law stuff's nonsense. I mean, and here's the point. If they're going to engineer an event that never really happened, what do they gain from doing it? What is the purpose? If people think these are all engineered events, what are they actually going to gain from doing this? They've told us for years there's this war on terror. They keep telling us there's these terrorist threats. The reality is they are real. They are going to happen, and they're not going to get any less that we're going to see them. And we've seen sporadic events happening all over Europe. And this is unfortunately the way it's going to be until somebody decides to actually deal with the problem and have a global perspective, which the Chinese and the Russians want to have, and a global approach as to how we deal with this, because these sporadic events, you cannot stop them. I mean, they say watch 20,000 people suspected, jihadists or however you want to call it in the UK, but you need at least 10 people per person. As we said before, we don't have the resources to do this, but there needs to be an understanding of what caused all this in the first place, and there's no recognition from European nations in this example. And the interesting thing, of course, is as much as the UK is going to leave Brexit, they've signed, they're signing a new security treaty with the EU, which they want to bring into existence after Brexit to maintain and intensify cooperation, because they're understanding there is this cross-border threat. It's not an illusion. It's not an idea to take away people's liberties and control. It's a fact. It's a reality. It was always going to happen that if you defeat the terrorists in the Middle East, what are they going to do? They're disaffected because they were sold a lie. They were sold an illusion. They were told all manner of things that went on in Syria that weren't the case. They've now lost. A lot of them have died, and they're very, very angry. And they're redirecting that anger towards the West because, they were made promises and given assurances. It's not come to pass. So they're not only angry with in terms of their own organizations they were joining, but because indirectly, of course, they were made promises. They were paid. We know that the West's trained, armed, and financed them, and what you sow, you shall reap. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing. And undoubtedly, to suggest that I'm not saying we're going to have this, and I'm not over-egging the situation, but we have to be aware that these threats are ever present at the moment. And the fact that the UK has a severe status in place, I think is absolutely true. It is. There is a risk of it, because to suggest otherwise would be ridiculous. But yes, there has been strange false flag attacks in the past, strange things going on. But we've got to get past this point that every single attack now, it didn't really happen, it was fake. Well, how about these people who've died? I mean, the Manchester bombing was an example. There's people coming on television saying, at a funeral, burying their children who were killed. Now, are we seriously saying these people are actors? This was all a big facade. And these genuine people were going on TV. And imagine how I or you or anyone else would feel if the statement was made, well, that didn't really happen. That person's child didn't die. In fact, they haven't got a child. Oh, it was a complete crisis actor. It never happened. That is the most degrading and insulting thing you could ever say to anybody. And it really does. It annoys me because instead of pretending that everything's an illusion, let's deal with the reality that we do have these problems.
Correct.
And they have come about because of insane Western policy. And let's actually reflect, not us, but why this is happening, and the pressure needs to be put on governments and make them realize the reality of what their actions are causing. Now, I'm sure to some extent the realization is starting to hit home, but it is a major problem, and that's why the European Union nations, although as the European Union won't exist in the future, but this idea, the EU army, it's another cabal instrument to try and control and subjugate people. No, it's not. It's a recognition that the days of NATO are finished, and at some point Europe's going to have to look after its security matters. And yes, it will integrate with Russia in the process. And Russia's already said to the European nations, when the time's right, we'll assist you in ridding the scourge of the terror cells that exist in Europe. But they know at the moment that's not possible because of the insane sanctions and the whole Russophobic mentality. But that is the plan in the future. And Russia will gladly assist with that because it's in their interest, because terror cells exist in Europe that then go and commit atrocities or try to in Russia. So a unified approach is needed because every nation is at risk from this all over the world. It's not this idea, well, they're just going to strike in Europe, so we don't need to worry about this. It's absolutely not the case, because these disaffected people are not just, yeah, some of them have been rehabilitated and don't want to fight anymore, but you're always going to get people to replace them. The only crumb of comfort comes out of the likes of Syria is that a lot of their financial capability has been strangled because the Syrian Assad forces have taken control of the oil field, so it's restricted their financial capability. I don't believe for 1 minute the financing and arming that's gone on in the past is going to happen anymore. They literally had to become a self-serving entity who had to pay their own way and pay for arms. They're not going to get everything for free and in the process. And that kind of also brings us on to an interesting point where there's a report came out that exposes Pentagon falsifying documents and using private arms dealers, probably in Eastern Europe, to transfer billions of dollars worth of old Russian-style weaponry to Daesh affiliates in Syria. I mean, the documentation was fudged to make it look as though it wasn't, but of course the Pentagon's denied it. But it's pretty obvious that there's some shenanigans going on, but it doesn't mean that these organizations don't have to pay for the arms. But that's what the whole point of selling the oil is. But the question then is, who are they selling the oil to? But these very ugly deals have been going on. I mean, yes, the CIA covert weapons program was shut down and stopped. That didn't stop them being provided with arms. And then they used the sort of network of private arms dealers, seemingly from Eastern Europe, and all the arms get filtered there, as we said, to Syria. That is going on. It's probably being cut off to a large extent now. And it's also indicative of another reason why the kind of Daesh are seriously in retreat. And now the Syrians control 85% plus of all their territory. I mean, not that long ago, it was only about 50%. So it shows the rapid progress that's been made in that regard in terms of Syria.
Yeah. And Paul, back to what you were saying, a lot of these people saying, oh, this event never happened, this, that, and the other, and they hear the terminology false flag. And people need to be very, very, very extremely careful not to take the word false flag or the label false flag and start to broad brush and put it and paint it on every single event that happens. Because what happens is then we begin to take away from the real perspective here. There is an immigration problem in Europe. There is a serious global problem with fundamentalist Islam. It's a severe problem. Some people are very uncomfortable dealing with that, but it is what it is. It's especially when you've been from countries that have experienced these types of phenomena, especially with fundamentalist Islam. And folks, look. Here's the deal. It's a problem. It's a huge issue. It's the last remaining monotheistic religion that needs to be reformed, and reformed quickly. So let's be very careful here how we start calling everything a false flag, unless you take away the blame from where it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and that's the problem. I mean, yes, events have happened, as we said, but to label every single thing going forward a false flag will actually deflect away from where the problem is, because people will go, oh, it's the cabal, it's the deep state, they're just trying to engineer this. It's not a reality. It's not really even happening. No, there are real events happening, and I get very concerned when I hear people say it, because then I say to myself, well, okay, what's your motivation for inferring this is the case? And it could be genuine, they believe it, maybe it's ignorance, I don't know what it is, but it does deflect away from the problems we're seeing, and undoubtedly, yes, we do have a problem in Europe, and yes, most people who are immigrants are perfectly law-abiding people, but there are people definitely that have been smuggled through. There's people who've paid. I mean, I can say is most definitely there is people who've been smuggled into the likes of Turkey and have paid significant amounts of money to do so, who are Daesh operatives. Of that there is no doubt, and they've spread through Europe, and they're not here just to enjoy the European culture and everything else. They're here for a purpose, and they will lie low for years, months, whatever it is, but there is a serious risk. And to deflect away from that, as you say, is something that it diminishes the problem. It almost tries to make the average person feel who is awake, not the people who know nothing, because as far as they're concerned, yeah, it's a terrorist threat, and they'll go along with the narrative. But people who keep questioning it need to say, well, actually, is this really, maybe it is a false flag, maybe things didn't happen the way it's said, but those instances where things do happen and people do die, and it's genuine. We need to recognize it for what it is, because failing to do that does create a huge problem in people's perspective and understanding, and it does rightly diminish those responsible and what is really going on. And I'm not using that as a brush to tarnish everybody who comes to Europe. It's not the case. I mean, there's plenty of people who do come who perfectly, as say, law abiding and want to integrate. Yes, but there are elements who don't, and they have hijacked the whole immigration process. And that was always by design. The whole purpose for the cabal was to flood Europe with migrants, create these wars, create these situations in Libya and Syria and places, so that people would flee. But in the back of all those people fleeing, they infiltrated those people with elements designed to cause massive disruption in Europe and across Europe. And that's most certainly what's happening. And that needs to never be forgotten. It needs to be understood, and people need to make sure that's always factored into their thinking when they see these events happen.
Yep, absolutely. Paul, we're about 5 minutes left, man. Your closing comments and how people could follow you, as well as your contact info.
Well, thanks. I mean, I guess there's so much we didn't get around to covering today that is always the way. I mean, I think basically once again is follow what the Chinese and the Russians are doing. I think it's worth sort of paying attention a little bit. We didn't get a chance to talk about Catalonia and Spain. It's worth people looking into the developments there and the reality of what's unfolding, but we haven't really got time to talk about that today. In terms of the Middle East, well, we've seen massive developments and changes in terms of Syria. Certainly the whole map's changing in terms of Qatar. I mean, just a very small example is, I mean, the Saudis and the UAE have been hung out to dry because every other nation, I mean, it's like, is trading with them. I mean, even the UK have just announced that they're going to, that they've sold 24 Typhoon jets from BAE Systems to Doha. I mean, it's like the biggest slap in the face to the Saudis, the UAE, in terms of this Qatar embargo, which is rapidly disintegrating because no other nation takes it seriously.
Correct.
I mean, if they were really taking it seriously, they wouldn't be doing these, And what does the British Defence Secretary comes out? It's the first major defence contract with Qatar, one of the UK's strategic partners. That talks over the deal had taken several years, and it's culminated just at this point when the Saudis and the UAE are trying to convince us that Qatar's the bogeyman now in the Middle East, because we can't really say Syria is anymore. But it's that level of farcical things that are going on with Qatar. So that's just another small example of how, the Saudis and the UAE have been thrown under the bus, and everybody's throwing, even the US is starting to throw them under the bus. And although, of course, the perverse irony is that throwing the Saudis and the UAE under the bus is not going to help the US in any way, shape, or form, but it's to try and deflect away internally from the problems they have and trying to divorce themselves from nations that we know they've had significant dealings with on geopolitically, economically, and militarily for a great many years.
Yep, absolutely, man. It's funny. It's literally the pot calling the kettle black. They're like, we are the pots, and you kettle, you are black. It's ridiculous. Really.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the other thing I guess we can cover off, there's the German elections coming up, and Merkel's going to get re-elected, but there are some interesting things that maybe we can cover off. That he's not going to change the result, he's not going to change anything, but there are some little changes that may have a bearing on the future of. But Merkel's, okay, she's going to get elected. It'll be a coalition government again, because you'll only get about 37% of the vote, but that doesn't matter because it's the biggest party and she'll form a coalition. But there might be some changes that. So it's not really, we don't expect any. I mean, if Merkel loses the election, I'll be, well, I would say it was the biggest shock that's happened in the last 5 years. That's how certain is she'll get elected. So, but it might change certain things in terms of personnel within the government, and because there are other parties that have a very different view. So it might change some things but in the long term, it's irrelevant. Merkel's is just an irrelevance like all the other Western leaders. But yeah, just keep focusing on. I mean, it's difficult because every nation has big changes happening, and what we do is, the podcast, I cover a lot more detail on things that are happening on a daily basis, but on the shows we'll try to highlight things in a very broad sense, some of the bigger things that are happening. And we're now getting into autumn. It could get very interesting in terms of not just the geopolitics, but the economics. I'm not saying anything major is definitely going to happen, but it may happen or it may not. But we certainly need to be observant and see exactly when things really do start cratering even worse in the real economy. Forget the pseudo illusionary economy.
Got it.
And in terms of the website you mentioned, the SiriusReport.com, we've got obviously the podcast. We'd like people to subscribe, and yes, it's $4.75 a month. We think it's very good value and provide 5 podcast equivalents. Sometimes we do double podcasts, but it averages out obviously every week that we do 5. We also, yes, we've got the Facebook page, and we've got the Twitter page, which is the Sirius Report. And we're doing as much as we can. It's only the 2 of us, but we keep trying to put out some other content. We've done some stuff on the website lately, and we're getting a lot more traffic through that, which is very encouraging. And it's great to work with Rogue Money, and we thank them for the opportunity that we got in January to come on, and we enjoy doing this every week, and we hope everyone enjoys the shows. And it's just a way of trying to get some of the elements across, because frankly, we could sit here and talk for 4 or 5 or 6 hours, even though probably our voices are pack up. But there is that much going on, and it's very difficult in an hour to cover off everything. But we hope it gives people an idea of some of the things that are happening currently.
Yeah, absolutely. With that being said, folks, thank you all for listening in, and Paul, thank you yet again. I can't wait to have you back next week, where we get to cover even more things that I'm sure will happen between now and then, buddy.
Yeah, and thank you, and we look forward to it.
Absolutely.
It makes Mondays worth getting involved.
It's the only reason why I look forward to Mondays. You sit down for some serious. That's it. Thank you all for listening in, and CJ, take it away.